terms of, today's discussion, which is looking at learning outcome three. So this particular learning outcome three, focuses on, I would say, talking about inclusive teaching and learning. And when we talk about inclusive teaching and learning, what we are looking at primarily is the aspect of, looking at when you are actually in a classroom or, online or in a teaching situation wherein you're delivering, what you want to be able to do is basically cultivate or have an environment in which you make everybody feel included. That means you're treating them fairly, all the students, you're taking all the students along in terms of the understanding that is being built and obviously what you deliver, and most of them feel empowered that they have equal access to resources, the attention from the teacher, and also in some cases they feel that they are being supported in learning. So the whole concept of inclusive learning or inclusive learning culture that the teachers are required to create when they are in the classroom tends to be on the basis of the pedagogy that we look at, wherein you're looking at everything together in terms of making sure the weakest link is carried forward. Most of the learners that are in the class are essentially being supported with required, let's say, resources, and in some cases, if, for example, we have learners with disability or they need special equipment, say, for example, in such cases, they are taking into account while planning the sessions. You might have learners which come from diverse backgrounds, and in some cases, cultural nuances have to be taken into account. Some of the educational practices that we follow, traditional practices that we follow, need to be, let's say, tailored to meet their requirements. Or in some cases, if we look at very specifically talking towards the teaching and learning side, we go back to the basics of the learning style that we try and obviously understand what would make the learners learn in a way wherein in an environment wherein they are able to pick up things, and we want to know their learning style. So look at work in particular, look at the abilities of the student so that we are able to match their skills, their interest, their requirements with what we are putting together in terms of resources and our requirements for delivering the session. And essentially here, the goal that we would look at in particular would be to make sure that we provide equal opportunities essentially to learners to be able to participate and feel welcomed in the class. And this is where the whole process of designing the scheme of work in terms of how the delivery of the content is going to happen. You plan resources, you plan activities, you plan let's say different sorts of activities which could be engaging with the learners within the setup, and they would then follow through into detailed planning, or that planning being detailed down into lesson plans, which would mean that at some stage when you deliver and you start delivering, we know what is the overall content, what we know obviously the overall delivery of the content and how you're going to cover it, what resources are going to be used, whether it's videos, handouts, quizzes, you would do activities, or you do some sort of let's say give activities which would be looking at obviously pulling in let's say the cognitive abilities of the learners, but in some cases that would mean that they might not be able to carry them through, and in those cases the support that has to be put into place to be able to ensure that there is the settings that you create are responsive, the learners what you're teaching are able to understand and respond back to you, and they engage with you. And in those, there are 3 4 broad areas that we look at, and those broad areas, when you look at planning inclusive teaching, tends to be looking at the subject content, looking at the learners, their learning styles, their backgrounds, and obviously their abilities to be able to follow that content into the class. And this needs into what we are going to nicely cover in terms of how do we look at why do we need to devise a scheme of work, and then the scheme of work follows through into a individual lesson plan. And an individual lesson plan, if we do see learners falling behind in terms of how they are coping up in the sessions, would then lead into what is called the individual learning plans that have to be developed for learners essentially to maybe they require additional support and guidance, and that support and guidance keeps them engaged and obviously allows them to also tag along with the content and the other learners in the class. And this particular learning outcome focuses on teachers being able to develop what is called an inclusive teaching practice. And that would mean that this practice that you develop, um, and the practice that you develop with the experience and skills over a point in time, whether it's for a particular classroom, whether it's for children with disabilities, whether it's primarily in FE or higher education, there would be basic bits of it which will be required, that are essentially required to be understood. And those bits which I say are essentially nothing but the toolkit that we need to be knowing and having an idea in terms of how do we use the toolkit which helps us develop what is called the inclusive teaching practice within a particular setup, depending on what you're delivering, where you're delivering, and how does it support learners specifically in places wherein we see learners or teachers essentially dealing with difficult students, or I would say dealing with students which are predominantly having disabilities. And in such cases, the toolkit actually comes in handy. And this toolkit essentially encompasses and focuses on a broad area of requirements. And these broad area of requirements could be both internal to the school or the place, or it could be even external. So they could be, let's put it this way, areas in which the teachers have to be sensitive to the, say, for example, the learner's need. It could be that in some cases you have to act as somebody who encourages them to do or take risks and take up bigger challenges. In some cases, it could be that you, let's say, positively regard somebody's, let's say, non-participation in a class because they are going through maybe a rough patch or some sort of a situation in their family or something like that. And in some cases, you would also look at setting very clear expectations that this is the bare minimum that the students or what you are teaching in terms of learners, they need to be able to meet in order to say that, okay, the teaching has been effective in the class. So we'll be looking at, predominantly that bit, and in learning outcome 3, and essentially here the idea would be to, excuse me, go through some bits of it in the assessment criteria as well. And that is what we look at through the route of the presentation. Give me 1 second. So broadly speaking, when we look at inclusive teaching practices, or essentially strategies in terms of how teachers plan, let's say, making sure that the class environment is engaging, is something what we will depend on, will be the inclusive teaching concept as a whole together. Right. Excuse me. So, in terms of some of the key principles or key things that we need to be aware of when we are talking about this concept of inclusive practices in particular, that means which is where we are looking at ensuring that the classroom environment that we create is congenial or is basically conducive for all students, all learners, regardless of their abilities. And when we talk about abilities, what we are looking at, their cognitive abilities, critical thinking abilities, their academic level. And that is where, as a teacher, what we are trying to do is basically make sure that we are able to treat them equally, give them equal opportunities, and also ensure that if we do find some of them lagging behind or needing additional support, then using this is what we will be able to look at making a success in terms of getting everybody through, or getting, giving everyone the support that they need and the suitable resources with the environment that they need to be able to achieve the goals and objectives set for that particular session. Now, this could be classified into, or sometimes depending on the setting that you're in, I might say I'm doing a session, I'm doing a lesson. In some cases, it could be classed as classroom-based teaching, or in some cases, it could be also said that, okay, I'm looking at delivery of a particular program which happens at a site or as a boot camp. And really, depending on the situation, we will look at, making sure that everybody feels welcomed and, has the equal opportunities to be able to excel and obviously, achieve a particular goal which has been set for that particular session. Now, key principles of inclusive teaching and learning include accessibility, adaptability. We look at respect and sensitivity, collaborative learning, and obviously continuous feedback. So sometimes you would see that at the end of the sessions, most teachers would ask their students, or towards the end of the semester, sometimes you would see that there are surveys or questionnaires which are served to collect feedback, and that tends to be the feedback which is coming in, using a 360-degree appraisal, wherein students are able to feedback to a form tutor or their tutor in the class or in the school to say, okay, this is what I've learned, this is what was good, this is what was not good. And the idea there is the school or the authorities on a larger angle are collecting some sort of a feedback on how the assessment teaching practices have been delivered during a particular term. And those feedback sessions and the feedback which is collected from those questionnaire surveys sessions then helps to refine further strategies in terms of how teaching needs to be delivered within a particular setup. This could be reflective on, if we talk specifically, that if learners, for example, from year 6 need to go to year 7, they go from, they take up an exam at the end of that key stage. And if they don't pass the exam, then the performance is reflective directly on the school and also the tutors or the teachers essentially teaching that particular class. So there are regular exams testing which typically happens even before the final key stage exam happens, uh, that the school will conduct a mock, and obviously they will then look at picking up, for example, areas wherein they feel certain students are weak or would need additional support, and then additional classes or sessions are organized specifically for those students to be able to ensure that they are able to meet that requirement of passing the key stage exams. So those areas in which we generally see that when we look at inclusive practices being developed, the idea there is to look at making sure that all learners are provided equal opportunity, and this equal opportunity that we talk about tends to help them participate and learn and creates an environment or an atmosphere where they feel welcomed and they feel supported, and that means that it creates a positive environment for the teaching and learning to happen within a particular setup. Now, in my case, what I've done is simply because I'm in higher education. So what I've done is I've looked at how do I develop a scenario wherein my teaching tends to be inclusive. And say, for example, for a particular subject that I teach, which is strategic management, what do I do to create, an environment which makes my learners welcomed? They feel confident that they are attending a session or attending a class wherein they are able to learn, they are able to contribute, and they are able to obviously look at, in some cases, obviously achieving grades that they want to achieve, like pass, merit, and distinction. So in my case, the context, as an example I've taken is that, okay, being a lecturer for strategic management, in order for me to create an inclusive teaching environment for my students in the university, what I need to do is make sure I understand the background from where the students come from. If there are different cultural backgrounds in my students, I need to have at least an awareness of, or be sensitive to their backgrounds in terms of where they come from. And most importantly, some of the things that teachers are requested, or I required in this case to understand and probe, is that if learners have any sort of disabilities, and disabilities need to be identified so that adequate support could be put in place even before the session or the teachings actually start. And if we do identify learners which have disabilities, then in such cases, additional support, which could be not just provided by you, but it could be support which could be provided by the establishment. It could be support which is provided by by making sure that there are, some sort of additional resources available, which could be provided to the learner in order so that they do not feel that they are being disadvantaged or they are feeling left out because that is something that they don't have access to. Now, in my case, what I would, just as an example to explain the overarching concept of inclusive teaching and learning, there are strategies that I need to look at in terms of creating, which would essentially mean that if I have a learner which has some sort of a, say, a disability like dyslexia, which is a learning difficulty, and that primarily affects learners wherein they are not able to sometimes accurately pronounce words or read text which has been given. So in some cases, what we tend to do is give them printed, material, which is primarily the course material. The course material, which is printed, primarily tends to be, slightly bigger in font size. It is, formatted in a particular way, which makes it, convenient for them to be able to read and, allows them to overcome some of the disabilities that they have because of, say, dyslexia. And some part of it is also done in terms of printing in different colors using different pages. So it allows them to basically, visually remember and helps them process the information which is required, in some cases with regards to the session material, the lesson material which is provided. Now, when we look at, if we know that there is this particular requirement, and if we know it before the start of the course, then there are lots of things that can be done. And predominantly as a teacher, what I get into is when I get somebody joining the course for the first time, I would normally send them out what is called a WARC style questionnaire. And that WARC style questionnaire would essentially help me understand, what are the favored learning styles in the class in this term with the learners which are studying in this term. Then in some cases, what I would also do is find out if they have any special requirements. And in this case, if they have any special requirements, say, for example, in some cases, we need to ensure that most premises are D1 enabled. That means they have disability, wheelchair access, and those kind of things are enabled in the building so that people do not feel disadvantaged to be able to access those facilities. And then during the course of delivery, if we do find that people have certain requirements, if they sometimes you would see in the classroom, which is a practical example, is that apart from what you discuss, apart from what you lecture on, you sometimes take use of giving printout or handouts, essentially, as I would say, to learners, because that helps them to remember or understand the key concepts or theoretical frameworks which are being discussed. So although discussions are great, group activities are great, but at some point in time that these discussions and activities need to be nailed into some sort of assessment criteria or essentially tasks in the assignment. And that is where teachers use handouts which are specifically given out for important concepts and theoretical frameworks. And they would essentially be a combination of, no, they would be essentially a combination of sometimes, in my case, for example, they tend to be a combination of mind maps. Tends to be a combination of links to YouTube videos or TED Talk videos, and in some cases, pure handouts, which could be extracts from, certain books or concepts which are required for the learners to be able to understand. Because what you do is you discuss the concepts in the class with the examples, and with the examples they're able to understand it better, but the theoretical part of it and the framework part of it that they need to understand in terms of background, when it was, how it was created and why is it widely accepted, the research behind it sometimes need to be given out in handouts, which learners would be able to go back, read, and then obviously bring that back into some sort of work that they are presenting. And that tends to be creating an environment wherein you are verbally, you are visually, and you are also using some of the contents that you are delivering by giving them handouts which are going to be useful for them from a point of view of creating a memory that, okay, this is what needs to be remembered for this particular lecture, and this is what is important for us to understand when we look at processing it with regards to, say, meeting some activities or some assessment criteria. And then towards the end of the session, I normally always ask them, which is to say, was the session okay? Did you understand whatever, what things we have covered? So in my sessions, normally when you start, you have a lesson plan. And that lesson plan tells to be, okay, for this 1 hour session today, I'm going to be looking at covering this, this, this. And before you start off as a lecturer, as a teacher, what you normally do is put down some of the key bullet points of what we want to accomplish in today's session. And those bullet points or key points that you put down essentially help learners understand that these are the remit or the areas in terms of discussions which are going to happen today in the class. And then towards the end of it, what you do is you confirm whether that has been understood, whether that has been covered. And I normally would write it down on the right hand side on the whiteboard. And then at some stage, keep ticking them off, saying that, okay, this has been covered, this has been covered. And then I look at taking some feedback towards the end. And that feedback towards the end, gives me confidence and confirms that, yes, I have been able to cover this with learners mostly understanding what was required.
Sorry, that's actually a really good suggestion. So how I currently do it is I will always have, I always so I do like a PowerPoint presentation for my lessons. So what I have at the moment, we call them learning intentions or learning objectives. So if there's 3 learning objectives to achieve during the lesson, so they're within the PowerPoint presentation, and then I always make sure that I've got the learning intentions in each of the students' books, and then they can tick. But I think what you've just said now, because sometimes that's something I'm still working with, like ending my lessons. I think that might be a really nice way to do it, is just have them literally on the board, even if I print it out, stick it on the board. And then I think I'm just thinking of one of my classes in particular, one of the students I think would really like that, to kind of actually be able to physically tick it off.
Yes.
I think that's actually a really good suggestion.
Yeah. So in some cases, what you also do is, because you're going through with the session in your class, and sometimes you have learners, they start interacting. If the concept is, for example, or a framework that you're discussing is really difficult to understand, sometimes you have to break them out into activities or discussions that you need to do, and that consumes the time. So it also helps you keep an idea and keep your eye on the timeline in terms of what needs to be covered. But generally speaking, with teachers, as you rightly said, that you go into a session, you have certain objectives to fulfill and meet. That is where what we want to be able to do is also look at managing time by writing those bits out, whether it's on a PowerPoint slide or on a whiteboard. It tends to give them a bit of an idea that, okay, I'm going to spend 20 minutes on this, 30 minutes on this, 10 minutes on a recap before I end the session. And that is where sometimes what you also have to look at is that if there are learners who are asking lots of questions, queries, then I need to look at being prepared in terms of my handouts, that, okay, I would give them a case study to read, or I would give them a bit of a homework to say, for this particular area, it's best that you read this particular case study or go through this particular handout, which will give you more insight into with regards to examples, because I need to be able to look at managing time. And in some cases, yes, if the concept is totally missed, then I need to basically look at this as a bit of a feedback for the next session, is that I need to maybe drill down or lessen the number of objectives that I'm covering, because this is something more important, or is an objective which probably learners need a bit more time to be able to grasp. And that adjustment that you do in your class while you're teaching is what is allowing the teacher to also tailor its delivery to meet the requirements of the students, in terms of not rushing it through, and obviously ensuring that everything that is being covered is actually making sense, and it is helping learners to master that concept, or that topic that is being discussed. Now, with this basic understanding, what we want to be able to do is look at what is the toolkit. When I say, when we talk about the inclusive teaching practice, and when we talk about in general, what are the areas that we need to be able to look at to be able to start to say that, okay, the delivery that I do is meeting the requirements, not just from a curriculum standpoint of view, but also meeting the requirements of the setup, which is maybe the school or the college, And in some cases, definitely in cases also meeting and helping to meet the requirements which the learners have, why in terms of why they've joined the course and things like that. So when we look at this toolkit in terms of the inclusive teaching, and how do we develop inclusive teaching habits, or the methodology in terms of whatever subject areas that you teach, what we need to be able to do is basically understand that what are the basic strategies that we can put in place to identify that my teaching or the teaching that you do as a teacher is actually taking into account all the broader aspects of requirements of learners, their abilities, the curriculum requirement, and also the requirement of, say, for example, a term. If I need to get my learners through this particular term, this is the coverage of the content that needs to be done. Their understanding and whether that delivery has happened to meet that criteria can only be done when some sort of an evaluation typically tends to happen, and that could be because of a test or an assignment or some sort of let's say a task which is given, and that is something which is completed by learners to a certain level, satisfactory level, and that allows that allows or informs you that yes, the teaching and the delivery that you've done has been to the standard and has been done to the curriculum requirements to be able to meet that timeline. So what we look at in this case is, what I would suggest is, there are 3 or 4 things that you have to get hold of. One is scheme of work. There's a template that we can provide. You have to get hold of what is called a lesson plan template for a particular topic or the subject area that you teach in. We also need to look at what is called an individual learning plan, or ILP as we call it. And last but not the least, we need to have access to WARC learning style questionnaires, which are essentially filled, by, say, for example, 1 or 2 learners, just to attach them to the annexure. One of the other things that you can also do is you can also have access to what is called initial assessments. Now, in the case of functional skills, English and maths, what we do is, say, for example, we do initial test assessments to gauge their level of English, whether they are at entry level 3, 2, 1, or they are at level 1 and 2 for English, and maths, obviously, whether they are at different levels, level 1 and 2. Now, these, if you have, and along with that, obviously, as a teacher, if I have the, say, for example, the course handbook, or for example, in some cases, depending on the place you teach in, you might have a topic list. So if I look at schools, for example, it could be a topic list which the form tutor has. In the case of FE and HE, it could be a course handbook or a program handbook that you have, and that would inform that, okay, what is the topic, what are the broad content that has to be, areas of the broad content, or the topics
I
with
don't
regards to
actually,
syllabus has to be covered in terms of delivery of that teaching and learning.
I don't actually devise the scheme of work, but what I do is I get a copy of it from the PSHE lead. So
Yes.
she'll give me like the scheme of work, and then from that, that's how I kind of, and then she's got obviously what they're hoping to achieve like in each lesson. So she'll give me like the topics. So for example, last half term they were learning about like relationships and sexual education. This half term we've been doing about well-being, so physical well-being, mental well-being, like looking at that in relation to social media and well-being. And then
That's correct. So in some cases, when we look at a particular setup, sometimes what happens is that we are not looking at devising the scheme of work ourselves. It is probably done by the program tutor or the program manager, or in some cases, maybe somebody within your team who has the responsibility of designing and creating the scheme of work, adapting it from, say, for example, some national curriculum.
yeah, so she obviously has
Now,
that, and she
yeah.
obviously, but then from her, she devises a scheme of work, and then from that, then that's when I build my lessons. So I plan my lessons, I look for resources, and then that's when I sort of put my my lessons together from that. But I don't actually devise it. So she's obviously got the
That's correct.
curriculum topics, what they need to cover. So then I build my lesson plans from that. So would that be sufficient then to provide evidence?
That would be okay, yes. So just to share with you, for example, we have obviously in our case certain templates that we use, for various, let's say courses. This is one which is one for ESOL, and at different levels we have a scheme of work. Now this is required is because it gives us a snapshot of what all is required to be covered in this, as a syllabus with the learners. And then how is that divided across number of sessions, what topics are going to be covered, what core skills which the learners would be able to develop, and how would we evaluate and measure that, yes, these sessions delivery, the delivery of these sessions have been successful, because at the end of it, we'll be conducting some sort of an evaluation, and that evaluation would have a basic benchmark in terms of learners being able to achieve that. And the most important bit, which the program manager, or in this case, the course leader, course tutor, whichever way you put it, would need to ensure is that there are adequate amount of resources available to be able to teach and deliver this in the classroom. Now, this is an extensive scheme of work for an entry level English that we teach to learners who are basically not having English as their native language. And these sessions tend to be, there are 21 sessions. That means the delivery is across 21 weeks. So when you look at the scheme of work, you get lots of different, in bits of information from it. You're able to collate the details on the number of sessions or the number of terms which are required to be delivered in terms of ensuring the coverage of syllabus. You get a list of resources, you gather a list of resources from what is expected to be taught in some of these sessions, and how and where and what would be the resources required. You would at some stage also be looking at gathering a list of key skills which the learners will be able to, cover and then achieve by going through this topic list or going through the various sessions that are planned, in order to deliver this syllabus. And then you would also look into sometimes that when these sessions are delivered, are they linked to any other form of, delivery? That means, is there a cross linkage between any of the topics that you're covering? So, for example, if you had basic health and safety at work, that could be a topic which could be related to another, maybe part of the course at a different level. So there could be cross referencing, which would be required, or in some cases, that would be signposted to the learners to say that if you keep and you make a keen observation of some of these topics which are required, which you're studying in this particular session, and we will be reflecting on these in the next stage, and you'll be building on to either increasing the complexity of the understanding of some of these topics at the next level, or in some cases building on, with regards to referencing some of them into examples and practical applications. So there are lots of things that you can gather, and put together from the scheme of work. And that is why it is important before, as teachers, before we get into any form of, teaching and delivery in the classroom, we need to have an overarching plan or some sort of a bigger picture of what is to be achieved, what is to be delivered, what is to be taught, what would be the basic requirements for us to be able to successfully teach and deliver, and how some of these actually tie into sometimes, looking at when we look at schools, sixth form and higher education, how they tie into, the national curriculum, and the specifics which are provided by Department of, Education. Now, this schema work is then broken down into individual learning plans. So, for example, if I have session one, and that is the schema work, I might need to break this session down into individual lessons which would be delivered to cover this particular topic list. So, in the first one, for example, if it starts with introduction, induction, greeting, knowing the students in the class and getting to know each other in the class, and then also finding out about a bit of their personal background, their personal information, that would primarily be the first session that you would do. Now, if I go into something, for example, the second session, and it talks about pronunciation, spelling, looking at alphabets and things like that, then in those cases, sometimes the content of it might be difficult to cover in one session. And this particular session would be broken down into what is called smaller sections that will be delivered, individually, as sessions, and that would be something called the lesson planning. So what we are going to go into is, this is the overarching topics that we are covering, but we would need to break them down into further detail, and this further detailing essentially would come in, in the form of what is called lesson planning. And that lesson planning would be, if I do a lesson planning just, for example, for pronunciation and spelling, then in those cases, my lesson planning would then need to go into individual lessons of how I would teach and deliver, and talk about the concepts of pronunciation, spelling, and what would be the resources learners would need to have in terms of, in this case, it is saying joining a library, knowing about common signs and alphabets, and those would be the bits that you would need to then look at providing to learners as resources. Now, when we look at lesson planning, what we're looking at is the lesson plan is also going to be a bit of a roadmap for the, for the teacher or the lecturer, which is what is going to tell that if I start this session, what are the things that I need to do before I start my class? What are the things that I'm going to do during the class? And what are the things that I'm going to ask my learners to do after the class is being conducted? So in some part of it, if I would reflect, would be that I would break this session down into maybe 2 or 3 different lessons. First lesson would cover the basics of it in terms of giving them idea about why they need to learn and spellings, why they need to know the alphabets, and slowly and gradually go into spellings and pronunciation. During the class, I would talk about more by taking examples of key aspects of how do you look at identifying alphabets, words, spellings, or and then obviously create them into words, and at some point in time talk about the phonetics of it. How do you pronounce them? How do you then relate them to spellings? And then after the class, I might want to give them some homework for them to be able to practice, and that would also allow them to reflect on whether they've understood the topic, or and when they submit the activity back to you in the next class or the next session, then you're able to check on and evaluate whether they have successfully understood what has been delivered in the previous session or not. Now, so scheme of work tends to be a bigger picture, and your lesson plan tends to be the specific that you're going to talk about in a particular session. Now, when we do get into the devising of the scheme of work, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to look at certain basic fundamentals. If I take you back to the presentation now, so what we need to be able to do is get into some specific fundamentals of what is required to create that scheme of work. So broadly, there will be a picture in terms of this will last one term, so one semester, 3 months. It will include these topics which are given across by the curriculum, and these topics essentially would be required to be covered within these areas. And then once these topics are covered, these could be the set of assessments that the students would do to confirm whether the teaching has been to the target and whether the learners have understood the content part of it in terms of what is being delivered. And this plan would at some stage be married into an overall plan for the school, or overall plan, for the class, or for the number of sections which are there in that class, so that we see a comprehensive movement in terms of delivery, teaching happening, delivery happening, achievement happening, and then the evaluation happening to confirm that the understanding and achievement of the topics are there. And this would then allow teachers, or in this case sometimes in schools when they say form tutors or course leaders, to be able to tick and confirm that this has been covered comprehensively. There is evidence that the learners have been able to develop skills, and the knowledge has been tested through some sort of assessments which have happened subsequent to the teaching and delivery which has happened in the class. Now, when we look at this particular aspect of schema work, at some stage it is required for us to break it down into the like a blueprint. And that blueprint, for example, in my case for this assessment criteria, I've explained that if you were to teach functional skills English at level 2, which is normally a 12 weeks program with us, how do I look at the coverage of the content across the 12 weeks, to ensure that one, all the top major topics have been covered as per the schema work. There is adequate coverage on the individual sessions, and then it leads to the development of skills and knowledge towards the end when the learners are going to be tested on an exam, which is going to be a synoptic assessment at the end of it, to confirm whether they are at that level 2 or not. So what we tend to do in this case is create a bit of a blueprint, and that blueprint would be termed as a schema work. So we start off with a bit of an introduction, go into some of the learning objectives, assessment criteria, and what is expectations from the learner's end. We look at some of their teaching, detailing down on some of the teaching activities which are going to happen, and then talk about in individual teaching activities what are the key activities that would be done. Say, for example, in the first session, it is just going to be an icebreaker to understand the students, complete initial assessments, get to know them a bit better, get them to know each other in the class or the sessions a bit better, and then provide them course handbooks, slides, activity workbooks, and things like that to be able to get them started onto the course. And then in English, you have reading, writing, speaking, listening, and communication. There are 5 components, and what we've done is broken them down into week-wise or in terms of session-wise for delivery. And that is given some sort of a timeline to say, okay, this is going to be talked about and covered in about 12 weeks. So Monday to Tuesday, you have sessions which are typically on in the class. Wednesdays and Thursdays are self-study, wherein the learners are looking at covering activities in workbooks. Friday tends to be a bit of a reflection, wherein they come in and show the work to the teachers, or in some cases, if they need additional help, support, if they've not understood what is required to be done, then one-on-one tutorials could happen on a Friday. That, if we see, is something which the learners are falling back on quite often, then that leads to the development of what is called an individual learning plan. That means for that particular individual, which we see as areas that are, say, for example, there are other areas that need to be improved in order for the learner to be able to go to that level, then in those cases, additional activities, targets, or, in discussion with the learner, some activities and targets are set for them to be able to complete, and they are given some additional exercises or additional activities to complete in order to bring up their knowledge up to the level which is required for them to complete this level of course. Now this bit is done as a blueprint on a macro basis by the tutor or the course leader, and that would be the schema work which is designed. Now, taking the schema work, individual teachers like Patricia and Catherine would then go in and do their own lesson planning. Now, planning is going to be specific for a specific teacher, because not all teachers would be able to teach and deliver the content in the same fashion or in a similar way, and everybody differs to a certain extent depending on the number of students they have, the abilities of the student, and obviously their prior education level at which they're coming in and studying this particular course. So both of them will go back, and what they would then do is basically looking at this plan of work, which is the macro plan that has to be covered in this term. They will then start to devise their individual session planning. They will go into individual session planning that they will do in terms of lectures across Monday, Tuesday for the next 12 weeks. And they would break each of these, session plan down into more details. And that more detailing is going to be something which is going to be covered in what is called lesson planning. So when we look at lesson planning and a template for lesson planning, we have lots of templates for lesson planning, but a lesson plan template primarily would be the details of what is expected to be covered in the class. So if I were to give you an example, if I were to have say a meeting with my teachers, I would be looking at dipping into what is called the schema work to say, where are we with regards to the progress in terms of delivery for this particular term? What are the things which have been covered? What sessions have been delivered? What are the requirements and things like that? But if teachers were to have this meeting at their own level, wherein with colleagues and peers, and they were to look at, okay, this is what is being delivered across different cohorts or different sections, then they would basically go into more detailing of the schema work, and that would go into what is called lesson plan. So individual class, every time a class happens, what is being delivered in that class, what is being taught in that class, and that would take into account things like learning styles of the learners, the initial assessment which has been done, what is the prior knowledge which the learners have, and what is the prior qualification or the previous level that they've done. And that would be all taken into account with regards to how do I do the seating in the class to a certain extent. So sometimes what you do is you mix and match students with the abilities in order for the student to be sitting with colleagues or other students, but they would then pick up certain skills because they are being paired up with students or other children in the class in such a way that it allows them to pick up certain skills. And the one I would say who's a smart or sometimes you look at a combination of smart and a little less smarter student together. They're sitting on the same table, and the idea is you're trying to shadow or mirror the student which does not have certain abilities to be able to pick up those abilities from his or her counterpart. So seating has to be looked at. You look at the environment in which how the class is going to be delivered, the activities that you're planning. Sometimes when we do presentations and group discussions, we change the physical seating of the classroom into a circle. So all the learners are facing each other and the teacher is able to go into the circle and then get everybody to engage in terms of activities. Sometimes you have a seating in the classroom, which is the traditional seating, and they tend to be, looking at a classroom-based setting wherein you are giving a lecture. If you do outdoor activities, you need to plan them. And in some cases, these are important is because they are helping to develop certain types of skills which are required for you to bring in into the classroom, for learners to be able to, lean on them and then, relate it to the learning that is required to be done on that, say, a particular topic. You would also look at, if you're doing outdoor activities, you'll also look at risk assessments. Sometimes, like we have trips that you take the students out to, you do a risk assessment to ensure, there is no risks to physical risks, safety risks, essentially for the learners. And that is something that is going to be a part of your lesson planning. Now, one of the things that you would look at within the lesson plan is detailing on the resources which the teachers would use. Are you using a projector? Are you using PowerPoint slides? What handouts are required? Are you going to give out any workbooks? Is there requirement of materials like pens and papers and pencils? Are you going to use any props? Are there use of any timers? So in the case of English, when we use timers, we use certain props, and all those resources have to be within the class to be able to make use when the teacher is actually teaching. Sorry. Then at some stage, you would also look at putting the context of the lesson down before you actually start the class. And this would go into, as you can see, the detailing of everything which is going to be covered in that particular sessions from a teacher's perspective. What could be the outcomes that you're focused on? What could be the activities that you're going to carry out in order to ensure those outcomes are met? How would you check the assessment or basically cross check whether the learners have understood what is being discussed and are they related, and how these activities or the assessments that you're carrying out are related to the schema work or the broader schema work in terms of coverage of content. All this is going to be labeled out in a lesson plan. Now, this is a very detailed example of a lesson plan. Sometimes lesson plan tend to be just one page. And what you're going to see is that essentially that one page consists of, just physical resources on the right hand side on the top as headings. What is the key objective of the session? What topics are going to be covered? And then you look at how this, how these topics are going to be covered by listing down a few activities. And then towards the end, what you do is how the evaluation of that activity would be done. And you relate it to why this particular lesson would be accomplished, because if these two, three things as confirmations come across from the evaluation, when you do that with the learners, that could be in the form of question answer sessions that you do towards the end of the session. It could be in the form of activity that is given out. And if the activities are accomplished, that helps you understand that, yes, the objectives or the targets for this session has been met. And in some cases, you end up giving some sort of homework or reflective, ask them to write a bit of reflection on what they have understood from this session, and then you collect that back for the purposes of self-evaluation, and that would give you feedback whether the session has been successful or not. So in most cases, what we look at is the lesson plan is specific for a particular topic. It could be that if we look at one session that is being delivered as per scheme of work, that could be divided into 2, 3, 4, 1, depending on the topics and the depth of the topics being covered. You might want to break it down and then cover that across as individual sessions in details to make sure that the learners have a good understanding of it. And that tends to be the second most important requirement that we need to have when we devise or pick up or are given, as teachers, scheme of work by our course tutors or, course leaders. So when you get that scheme of work, what you have to then do is basically consider the internal and external requirements, and then, break that down into individual sessions or lesson plans. And those lesson plans would then take into account the resource availability, the evaluation that confirms that the learners are understanding it, and then you're also looking into the key topics that you are covering with regards to meeting that requirement for completing that session. Is that okay?
Yeah, could that be uploaded onto Moodle if it hasn't already been?
Yes, that can be done, not a problem. Now, when we go into the second one, we are going into understanding what could be the teaching and learning plans that we need to have in order to meet the goals. So lesson planning would essentially be based on, when we create a lesson plan, the lesson plan would be based on what is called SMART goals. So we need to be able to deliver a lesson as a teacher and make sure that we are able to meet the individual, goals which are there for that particular session. Now, when I say from an example perspective that if I was to teach, have a session, based on a scheme of work on what are the different forms of writing styles. Now, in the lesson that I'm going to do, I'm going to ensure that the learners are able to understand the 4 or 5 different writing styles which are there when we talk about writing styles in English. So it could be descriptive, formal, journalistic, factual, and these could be the 4 broad types, but there could also be other types of styles which could originate from these 4 broader styles of writing. But my initial aim in the lesson would be to go into the class and ensure that I make my learners understand that why we need to know what are the styles of writing when you're addressing communication across to different sets of people in different organizations for different purposes. You would choose an appropriate writing style. I might need to give them additional handouts to say, okay, this is an example of a descriptive writing style. This is an example of an academic writing style. This is an example of a journalistic writing style. And this is an example of a factual writing style. And then in some cases, I might give them examples. I might say, okay, this is a company flyer. This is an example from a company website. This is a letter. And this is, for example, an article from the newspaper. Now, I would then do activities around it, and these activities would then challenge the learners to identify what that style is. But how would they identify it? Because I would have gone into details in terms of addressing that how do you identify each of these styles? What are the key aspects that you look for to say that this is this style or this is this style? So, for example, if I explain them journalistic writing style, I would say that this writing style is kind of you'd be able to recognize this writing style because this will have lots of open questions. It will look at engaging you as a reader or as an audience to read the article or read the topic. It would try and build consensus. It would give you some facts and figures which will be backed up by statistics. And at some stage, it'll ask you to engage by responding to or having a call to action. Now, if you see some of these characteristics in a particular style or a handout that I've shared, then you can surely go in and say, okay, this is journalistic style of writing. Now, in order for me to ensure that I'm able to then make sure that the learners are able to grasp the essence of this session, which is they are confidently able to identify the styles of writing and they are given the activity or given a certain evaluation, they would feel confident to be able to identify what are the features or parameters on the basis of which we can say this particular style, this particular article or this particular letter is this particular style. Now, when I go into starting this particular session, what I would also look at doing is understand the requirements of why this is being asked to be understood and where does it relate to in their learning of English as a language. And if I'm able to put this into context, then what I would do is primarily put this into the context of the curriculum and the broader picture of schema work that I have, which the learners don't see. But nowadays, what we also put it is that if we are teaching something, it is expected that you are also able to provide a schema work and a lesson plan, or at least the schema work to your learners so that they know that this is a topic list that they're going to go through in this particular term. Schools are required to provide it, publish it on our website. Even in FE, we see in further education it is done. Higher education tends to borderline between this requirement. Some colleges, universities do it. They give them a topic list. But if they are longer duration courses, sometimes, the topic list or a schema work is mandatorily required to be given. So learners can anticipate the timelines and also understand that these are the bits that are going to be covered in this session or in this term or across these many sessions and across the academic year. And that would also be giving them an indication that towards the end of it, I have an assessment to complete, I have an evaluation to complete, which could be in the form of a test that they take. It could be in the form of an evaluation from a point of view of an assignment that they do, or a combination of synoptic assessment, or in some cases, test plus an assignment, or in some cases, it could be a viva that they have to do in order to be able to pass. So in the case of English, one of the things that they would need to do at the end of the term would be that they would need to appear for a speaking listening test, and that speaking listening test will happen in a group of 3, and that would be one of the methods of assessment which will be internally done by a college or a test center, and the results of it would be confirmed by the external examiners. So in most cases, when we look at how do we look at let's say devising details of the schema work and converting the schema work into teaching and learning plans, we need to be able to keep into account 2 requirements. One, what are the individual goals of and the needs of learners? And the second is what are the curriculum requirements? So the 2 slides that I put together here basically explain that the lesson plan, if I and go and audit a lesson plan for one of my teachers, these are the 2 aspects that I look at. One, has the lesson plan been done with the objective in mind of ensuring that it is meeting the requirements of the schema work? Is it relating to the topics which are required to be covered? And is it moving the knowledge and the delivery of teaching and learning forward towards into some sort of knowledge building at the learner? And the second thing that I would look at is the lesson plan taking into account the individual goals and learners' needs? That means in some cases, you might not have all the students in the class which will be at the same level of, having the same knowledge and skills at a particular level. So in some cases, you might have to develop what is called an individual plan and set specific targets for the learners because they are on different, peaks and troughs in terms of their own understanding of the topic. And in those cases, when we look at delivery in the classroom, we need to ensure that we are taking the weakest link along, or we are able to work with all our learners, all our students, to ensure that the end of it, when it comes to evaluation or some sort of an assessment, they are all able to meet the minimum criteria which has been set for me to succeed as a teacher. Because at the end of the day, I'm responsible for, say, a cohort of 20 students, and they all need to complete, they all need to pass. Now, at what levels of achievement they do, what levels they achieve in terms of grades, that might be different depending on how much effort they have put in terms of achieving those targets. But the bare minimum on which I'm going to be assessed is on the basis of the assessment on the basis of the targets which have been set by the school or by the training center or the college, and they would need to be met. So children, for example, moving from key stage 1 to key stage 2, when they are tested, the teachers have a responsibility to ensure that the students are able to meet those requirements. And in those cases, if they feel that they are lacking, they need additional support or they need additional help, then classes are arranged, additional sessions are arranged specifically with those learners, with parents also being informed that why these are being done, because it's an important stage for them to be able to pass, and then that allows them to move to the next level. So those are the bits that are covered in terms of detailing on the lesson planning side of things. And that is why the template that I've shown, is a comprehensive template that we end up using to ensure that there is detailed analysis on the topics which are to be covered. The teachers are able to take into account the consideration which the learners have, for example, additional support, strengths and weaknesses, looking at diverse needs if they come from a different background, what is their prior knowledge, what are the reasons why they are taking up this particular course. In terms of, some of them take it up because they want to go through a test and then pass it and obviously need it for the purposes of immigration or settlement. Some of them are taking it up as a second language because they have no prior knowledge of English. And in such cases, what you would see is your the planning that you do in terms of delivery of sessions from an aspect of physical environment, seating, how you do the groupings of the students in the class, how much, what kind of behavior or attitude they elicit, and then looking at the activities that you put in place, pairing in terms of students, physical resources that are required. You take into account all those to be able to ensure that there are meaningful outcomes from the sessions that you're doing. And these outcomes are planned meticulously in the lesson planning which the teachers do across the board when they teach and deliver the content on a blueprint which is provided by the scheme of work. Is that okay?
Yep.
The third assessment criteria primarily focuses on explaining how planning meets the individual needs of learners. Now, one aspect is, okay, that I know that I've done the initial assessment, I've done the WARC style questionnaire, and I come across that this learner is a visual learner, this learner is an auditory learner. Now, that gives me some basic idea in terms of what is the requirement of the learners in the classroom. But how do you then look at going into the nitty-gritty of it? How do you plan that, okay, this learner would need this support, this learner would need, for example, these additional resources or help from me to be able to, cope in the class or the class sessions. So here is where we go into doing individuals meetings with our learners. And that is where what we do is we try and understand by looking at creating a student file, and that student file will have a lot of detail and information into it. For example, the application process, their background, their basic details in terms of their previous qualification, what they where why, what are the reasons they are doing this study of English, for example, level 2, and what is it that they want to accomplish, or what is the objective end result they want to achieve after attending this particular course. Now, after having that particular knowledge at hand, which comes to me from the student file, what I then need to do is relate it to the needs of the learners, where I would do is basically start to do some initial assessment. Now, a learner might come to me and say, I want to do a level 2 English exam or want to, but that is a desire, that is a want to. But what I need to do is I need to confirm whether the desire translates into the actual ability of achieving level 2 or not. So that is where, as a teacher, what I do is ask them to do an initial assessment. So when I look at an initial assessment, I then look at giving them an English exam, which is a multiple choice, assessment exam. And that multiple choice assessment exam should not take more than 20 minutes for them to complete. If they say that I want to do, I want to enroll and obviously study at level 2, then what I would do is give them a level 2 exam. And with that particular exam, what I would do is try and judge their abilities in terms of whether they are at that level to be able to achieve or not, whether they have that basic requisite to be able to study at that level or not. And that could be taking into account by asking them to do this diagnostic test. That diagnostic test would also help me understand what are their gap areas, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are the abilities and cognitive abilities that they have in terms of being able to achieve level 2. And that would then help me do some sort of effective planning by let's say looking at the results of the diagnostic test to say, okay, these are areas of strength, these are weakness areas, these are areas that they need to, improve on so that they are able to achieve level 2. And this level of planning that I do primarily by doing the diagnostic test or the initial assessment would be done on the basis of a number of things. So I would look at learning style questionnaire, I would look at giving them initial assessment, I would also ask them some direct questions. I would, in some cases, look at their prior knowledge and skills and in their prior qualifications. If a learner comes to me and they want to take admission into level 2, but also produces a level 1 certificate, that means it shows that the learner is looking at progression opportunities wherein they have already achieved level 1, but what they would want to now do is go up to a next level, and that is where the enrollment is at level 2. So when we look at those bits, we will be looking at understanding the various aspects of how I would, as a teacher, look at, confirming the skills, the knowledge, and the abilities the learner has to be able to achieve that particular level. So here, what I'm going to be looking at my, delivery and matching it with the needs of the learners. The reason why we need to do this is to understand what is the end objective at the end of it for the learner to come in and study the course with us. Now, sometimes you end up asking questions and you do a bit of counseling and you act as in the role of an information advisor and guidance counselor to say, okay, I know that I understand that you want to study this at level 2, but why do you want to study this at level 2? What are the reasons that you're looking at taking this level 2 qualification? Is it led by the employer? Is it a requirement at your place of work? Is it something which is related to your personal goal? Or is it something that you're looking at doing to meet a particular requirement? So in the case of, for example, somebody looking at doing teaching or applying for QTLS, and if they haven't done their GCSEs and A levels in the UK, if they're applying for ambulance and emergency services, or they're applying for a job in the NHS, numeracy and literacy is required to be tested, and that is one of the reasons why they would come in and obviously look at doing level 2 English with us. Now here is where the differentiated learning strategies would be need to put in place. So we would traditionally have a learner who has good knowledge and command over English, but the reason why they've been asked to retest or provide evidence that they've taken the test is because they must have done this about 10 years back, 15 years back, but the profession or the job role requires numeracy and literacy to be tested again. Now, in such cases, we would need to adjust our delivery. Instead of 12 weeks, we need to bring it down to 4 weeks, tailor it to meet the learner needs. And that is where I would look at my own planning and say, okay, basis the initial assessment that I've done or the diagnostics that I've seen or the prior qualification and experience I've seen on the CV plus the achievement in terms of a certificate, I do feel that the learner would be able to achieve level 2 in 4 weeks' time. And that is where the learner would not need to traditionally go through the whole route of studying the course and the course material, but they would be looking at revising some important bits of it by looking at doing practice tests and revising some of the key topics which are covered in the assessments when they happen. And that is where it allows me to put a differentiated strategy in place for a learner, which is a mature and an adult learner who has English as a native language, but the requirement for testing is primarily because of the job or the requirements from a point of view of the job that they're applying for. And when I look at all this, I would be considering things like, their objectives and goals. I'd be looking at aligning their goals with my delivery. I might put them into a batch which would be advanced learners achieving level 2, and that batch and the grouping that I would do would be different from the set of learners which is primarily going to go through the traditional route of going through it and studying for 12 weeks and then taking an exam at the end of it. But in some cases, we have to put learners across in different cohorts because they are at different levels of learning and different levels of achievement. And that is basically looking into how I would plan, these sessions or the lessons that I'm doing by looking at the individuals and their, let's say, in their learning journey, where they are in terms of their learning journey, and then put them into a appropriate batch wherein they would feel that okay, they are on an accelerated learning path because they are not requiring to go through the initial set of, let's say, the whole comprehensive set of planning and learning, which is required in the case of learners who do not have English as their native language. Is that okay?
Yep.
Now, the next one talks about explaining the ways in which teaching and learning plans can be adapted to meet individual need. This is where the ILP comes in. So when we look at learners essentially who need additional support, and because of, I would say, special requirements, or in some cases, um, uh, say, if I give you a practical example, sometimes what happens is we have learners who start, but because of extenuating circumstances, have to put the course on hold because of their circumstances in the family or on the job front or various other reasons. They decide that I would want to put the course on hold. Nothing wrong in terms of the individuals from a point of view of having any disability or any special needs, but primarily because of work circumstances, they need to put the course on hold because they're not able to spend that much time on it. Now, in such cases, what we have to look at is we, in such cases, need to keep the learners engaged, but at the same time, what we then need to do is basically put a different plan in place for these learners to ensure that they are also slowly and gradually edging towards completion. Now, in such cases, what we have to do is when we talk about traditional teaching, most places, what we will do is basically give an example that we have learners with special needs or disability, and that is where an ILP needs to be put. No, an individual learning plan can be put in place in different circumstances. Obviously, yes, it can be put in the case of special needs or when students or your learners have disability or any special requirements, but it can also be put in place because it could be because of their other extenuating circumstances which are not related generally to having disabilities. And in such cases, what we do is we put them onto a plan, and that plan tends to be a plan which will allow them to still make progress, still be making progress with respect to the cohort in which they are in, but although be at their own pace. And in such cases, you would look at, let's say, putting a plan in place which would essentially be related to what is called plan related to an individual, and that will be an individual learning plan. So let me just show you a template which I can share with you at a later stage. Just give me 1 minute. Okay. Well, Mac seems to have hung up. 1 second. Okay, so I will show you a template in a second. Let me just get the Mac to work again because it seems to have hung up.
That's all right.
That's surprising. Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, so I can close Windows, but should just be online. I think I might need to just restart for a second.
Okay, that's fine.
Is that okay? No worries. Just give me 1 second. Be online. Everything else seems to be working. It's just the Zoom, I think, which has got stuck.
Okay, that's fine.